Morning, everyone. You're doing okay? Can you hear me? Yes. Good. So again, my name is Wangui Kimari. I'm really happy to have been here with you for the last 2 days. It was really interesting for me to hear about how you're conceptualizing all of your different projects. And it prompted me to think about how to, in some ways, use my ongoing research, which was on the coloniality of urban space in Nairobi, to have bearing on questions of democracy. Today, I am very grateful that Alf gave me this title. I was actually very lazy and I didn't give Alf a title. But I'd like to talk about everyday politics and popular protests in Kenya. And in particular, I would like to think through 2 questions. So the first is, what did the anti-finance bill youth protests of June 2024 mean in the political history of Kenya? And secondly, how can they be placed in a longer struggle of what is often called a black radical tradition, and as well what I and another colleague term citizen bids to respond to imperial remains and imperial invitations. So that's what I will be talking about today. So to do this, I think it makes sense to also contextualize my journey to some of the conclusions I arrive at when I'm thinking about these 2 questions. So I'll talk briefly about my work. I think as a PhD student, don't ask me how long ago, because I won't tell you I'm very old. But my work as a PhD student, I think it has maybe bearing for some of you, and some of the processes and questions I was grappling with, the theories and approaches that shaped it, but also the conclusions from that process that then leads me to have some conclusions in response to these questions. But before I continue, everyone knows about did you hear about protests in Kenya last year? What did you hear about them, out of curiosity? Yes? Anti-austerity protests. Anything else, Adam, yeah?
Big thing was the youthfulness of the movement, but also not just young people, like a sort of a new thing in Kenya.
For sure. I'm going to come back to that point. Charlotte? That was the same point. Okay. Saratu?
I think what stood out for me was the use of artificial intelligence in transcribing language and using bots to simplify bills to, that was
Anyone else? No one heard about the burning of parliament? Come on, guys. A little bit. So interesting. Anyway, but I'm happy you all more or less know about the June 2024 protests. So I'll talk about my own academic trajectory and then how some of the research I did within a PhD in socio-cultural anthropology, how that got me here. But I need to say that, so while that research has bearing on my conclusions here, the June 2024 protests, as some of you have said, were unparalleled because of a conjunctural moments. There were conjunctural factors that led to this inflection point, some of which was generation, like Adam was saying. We have a very youthful population. Over 70% of Kenyans are under the age of 35. The other factor that congregated and emerged this inflection point was a finance bill in times of austerity when the government themselves were not being, for example, government actors were showing us their $800 belt and their $2,000 shoes while they were telling Kenyans to tighten their belt. What also congregated here was another factor that led to this conjunction was we had elections 2 years prior where we were told that our choices were between the dynasty or the hustler. So we decided to end dynastic politics ostensibly. So there was a congregation of factors, a conjunction that led to this inflection point. However, my main argument is that this is part of a longer tradition of protest that targets empire or targets what I'll explain later as imperial remains and imperial invitations. So how did I get here? And actually, it may make sense for me to show you some of the conclusions I'm making today and that I'll come back to. So the conclusions I'm making are, number one, the protests of today are an accretion of past struggles are informed by and reference struggles of the present past. And why I say present past here is because for us, I don't think time is always linear. There's always reinstantiations of the past in the present, etc. And then through these struggles, and this is direct reference to Cedric Robinson, who talks about the Black radical tradition. He says, through this struggle, a collective intelligence is born and shapes a practice that continues a Black radical tradition. The second conclusion I make is that it appears that across Kenya's most referenced inflection points, be it the anti-labor co-option in 1921, which was labor cooptation of Africans, forced labor in 1921, be it the strike of porters in Mombasa, our coastal town in 1947, be it the Nairobi general strike of 1950, or the Mau Mau struggles of 1952 to 1960, or all of these protests. The main target broadly, and this is a broad connection, is empire, or various articulations of empire, and what we're also calling an empire made locally or externally, and what we're calling imperial remains and invitations. Third, and actually particular to, it makes sense to think about necropolitics and Mbembe's theorizations of necropolitics. My third conclusion is that what is also common, despite the target, despite empire broadly, is that these protests are always faced with a necropolitical response. So necropolitics is present. The government is, the sovereign chooses when and who lives and who dies, you know? So yet, all moments, another similar factor, a factor that connects all of these protests beside their target, is that they are certainly shaped by conjunctural factors, particular events in space and time, but they always are faced, or they always encounter a necropolitical state response that dialectically shapes people's insurgent political engagements. And finally, trying to have some hope here, we need some hope. Despite the necropolitics and all of these interventions against empire and for actual self-determination, there's a continuation of a Black radical tradition, a continuation of a struggle in an interregnum, a continuation of, as Smriti was talking about yesterday, interstitial contestations which engender openings, no matter how tragic, you know? They are openings. So how did I get here? I'm going to take you back. Please don't make me tell you how far back. But my PhD research was anchored in this community, which is called Mathare, one of the oldest neighborhoods in Nairobi, but in fact, the neighborhood with really a place where there's still no systemic or systematic water grid provision. There's still no adequate housing, despite it being over 100 years old. So I came to this neighborhood really in some ways serendipitously, I think that's the English word, when I was 22 and I thought the revolution is happening tomorrow. It's gonna happen tomorrow. Who's 22 and still thinks the revolution is gonna happen tomorrow? Or who hopefully hopes the revolution will happen tomorrow? Anyway, so I came to this neighborhood when I was 22, and I came not as a researcher, but just someone who was trying to understand Nairobi. I had met the person who invited me in a protest, and so then that started my engagement with this community. And it took me a while. From when I went there, it was about 6 years later, I started a PhD. And initially, I'll just need to change the slide. So this is also Mathare. Anyone been to Nairobi? Okay, one person. Okay, you're all welcome. It took me a while I entered thinking I'm going to work on police killings, but ultimately what became evident is that there are particular spatial histories that allow not just for the persistence of police killings, but a long continuum of oppressive events. So in thinking about that, and it took me a long time, my PhD was 6 years, so don't feel sorry for yourself. All of you are doing so well in year 4 and year 3, but in my university, it was actually 6 years. So by the end of those 6 years, I was answering these questions. These were the main questions in my dissertation. So how do we understand, and I was an anthropologist, but I was interested in urban space, so I started focusing on the social histories of this urban space as narrated by people. So my focus was the anthropos, the person, but having a symbiotic relationship with the space. And so these were the questions I wanted to answer. How do we understand urban planning from its outlaws? And what I mean by outlaws, how I was steering outlaws here, were people who are pushed outside of the law. So they're pushed outside of the law. They have no recourse to the law. The Constitution exists, but they don't have any recourse to having it work for them. But also, they're consistently criminalized. So this is a coincidence of factors. You know, you don't have, there's a new constitution in Kenya. We have a 2010 constitution, which everyone says borrows from South Africa. So it's so great because you made this constitution after the fall of apartheid. So we are waving that flag that our constitution is so great. But so many people are outside of it. And not only that, but they are criminalized. So in Mathare, even if the constitution says you have the right to water, you have the right to adequate housing, this had no bearing for you. And what's more, your embodied existence is criminalized. So that's why I was saying, how do we understand urban planning from its outlaws? And then also, thinking about necropolitics, my second question was, what immaterial and material tools do poor urban residents use to navigate spatial management grids that decide not only who lives and who dies, but how those people who are left to die must live? And to kind of anchor these thoughts and these questions, I was thinking with approaches in various interdisciplinary fields. So urban political ecology, urban studies literatures, a lot of Southern urbanism, various anthropologies, the anthropology of empire, the anthropology of space, the anthropology of youth, the Black radical tradition, assemblage theory, and oral histories, as but a few examples. And perhaps something that you're also thinking about, these also informed my methods. So some of my methods were ethnographic fieldwork, which also involved a lot of beer drinking, but don't tell anyone. Participant observation, focus groups, field notes, transect walks, lots of walking, mental maps, trying to get people in having a transect walk, just understanding how people relate to space, so what memories are attached to space, etc. Archival data, so lots of looking at master plans and city council reports, and trying to understand how space was governed, but how people responded to that colonial governance of space, interviews, etc. So in all, following these questions and these methods, I arrived at these conclusions, which you will see in some ways overlap with how I'm thinking through, or I'm thinking about the protests that endure in Nairobi. So these were my conclusions. That Nairobi is still a colonial city, and imperial visions continue to shape the city politically, socially, economically, and ecologically. So really, the built environment, the logics that inform the built environment have not changed, despite our ostensibly post-colonial status, despite, formally, the logics in the laws, the logics of the built environment have not changed. Nairobi is still the colonial railway town that it was built to be in how it is governed. So the formal logics have not changed. My second conclusion was that the exclusions that this allows for, so this colonial city needs to be shored up by a militarization of space. So this is the necropolitics that still endures. Why, and especially in areas that were the native city. So in areas that were the native location, like Mathare, that were poor, I think the native locations here were called, anyway, the predominantly Black areas in the colonial period. So that's where you see not only the real trenchant imprint of a colonial city, but how the militarization of space is actually exacerbated in a neo-colonial period. So police certainly are criminalizing young people, but they're also deciding who gets electricity. Because if you have an illegal connection, it's the police who are going to come and cut you off. If you have an illegal water connection, it's the police who are going to come and cut you off. If there's an eviction, it's the police who are also there to implement that eviction. And this is worse in this period that focus on efficiency or profit that we call neoliberal. So my second conclusion was that this allows for this colonial city is shored up by the militarization of space. However, still trying to have hope. The people who have long been the targets of a violent colonial planning are still nevertheless who continue to determine the futures of Nairobi. And you can see this kind of overlaps with how I'm thinking about the enduring protests. Now, this was written up, and it's useful in what I was going to say next, in a number of articles, but one that I'll reference here in particular is Imperial Remains and Imperial Invitations. So that was in Antipode. Then there's another one in Urban Geography from a few years back called The Story of the Pump. And why I bring up, and all of these, and you'll see from time to time, I hope you'll see how my conclusions, but also these articles touch on a lot of what has been talked about here. For example, the Southern Interregnum, autocracy, youth and marginalized resistance, for example, in the presentation we saw from Ergas yesterday, I think, Kenya also has some inflections of an ethnocratic state that Passan was talking about yesterday. So I'm happy to I was hoping to try and emerge this a bit more, but some of which you can see in these articles. But in particular, it's in the former article, the one called Imperial Remains and Imperial Invitations, where we flesh out what we mean by imperial remains and invitations that I'm saying people have across the political history of this Kenya, Kenya is not very old. Kenya is less than 150 years old. Kenya in its colonial iteration is less than it's like 130 years old. So across this political history, across the century and a few years plus, what Kenyans have been, when they're protesting, what they're targeting is what I am calling imperial remains and invitations, really just empire making, the reinstantiation of empire. So what is this, and how do we think about it in this former article? So I hope you can see that. Here I say with my colleague, if imperial remains are theorized as residues, or in Stoller's terms, durabilities of racism and colonialism in the present, and which travel as unspoken distinctions into the fabric of contemporary life, as if everywhere and nowhere at all, we develop imperial invitations as a way to think through how current geopolitical formations, beyond the usual north-south configurations, participate in producing, even in their denial, what Sarkozy famously refers to as the tragedy of Africa. This South-South anti-Black humanitarianism, or maybe through articulations like BRICS, that we assert is solicited by African states, is severely understudied and requires, we argue, a theoretical language that can analyze how remains and invitations reaffirm the durability of empire. Now, I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more. So what does this mean for the June 2024 protests? That really are the entry point for me to think about longer history of protests. We'll talk about that. But first, I would like us to also participate in these protests. So I will play a short video that someone who I know very well took outside of their workplace. This is June 2024, and then I'll actually try and show you a short BBC clip of these protests. So this was June 2024. What do you think people are singing out of curiosity as I try and... What do you think people are singing? Anyone speak Swahili? Okay, guess. What can you feel from those protests? Sorry, I'm trying to also not show you my emails, but try and get this thing up. What do you think young people are singing?
Sorry, we lost the signal.
I removed it, but I'm so that you didn't read my email to a German student that I have. But what do you think young people are saying in that protest? But what can you feel palpable from it?
Well, it must be out with the old or out.
Yeah, they're saying the translation would be, in Kenya you say wametuzoea, so they are taking us for granted, basically. That they're, I'm trying to find a direct translation. They're what? Sorry, go ahead. It's Zulu, huh? It's almost in Zulu. They're like these geriatric politicians, you can edit that out if you want, but these geriatric old school politicians are taking us for granted. They think, one slogan I think that I mentioned earlier, I think when we met, was that young people are like, we're not our parents. We don't have respectability politics. We'll burn your shit. And they did. So that's what they're singing about now. But to give you a bit more context, let's watch this short BBC documentary so that you can get a snapshot of what the motivations or the impetus for these protests last year.
For years, when it comes to protests in Kenya, this has usually been the face.
So why I wanted to show you that is also to give you kind of the effective understanding of the protests, but also to illustrate some of what we've talked about, the necropolitics. You saw the police on the street, the particular conjunctural factors, the young people, etc. However, even, sorry. Okay, great. Even while people say it's unparalleled, they say these protests were unparalleled because of all of the young people on the streets. They say it's unparalleled because it was the spark here, although there's an accretion of sparks, was a finance bill that was going to tax people's lives in ways that were unforeseen. Tax on cancer treatment, tax on internet bundles that affects young people, taxes on sanitary towels, on kids' diapers, on land, so everyone was generally affected. So that finance bill was also seen as unparalleled. What was also seen as never happened before was that it was also intergenerational, despite the prominence of young people, inter-ethnic, across all towns, inter-religious, and also cross-class. It was so cross-class that even the, I'm not going to call him the name I really want to call him, but the majority leader in parliament, I can tell you later the name I really was going to call him, but the majority leader in parliament said, this is just, he's like, because it was so unparalleled and they couldn't explain it, he said, they're just these rich Gen Zs who eat KFC and who took Ubers. But this was never seen before. But he was dismissing these protests because he thought they were unsubstantiated, because they were not grounded in material realities, primarily because of this cross-class alliance. As much as they were unparalleled, they were also part of a longer history. Although I'll talk a little bit about of how some other people have narrativized these protests. So Njuki Kivedwa writes that the youth in Kenya, no joke. They stormed the National Assembly in Kenya on 25th June 2024. They set part of it on fire. They ransacked the hallowed building, smashing everything in sight. Some even ate the food in the cafeteria that was especially made for the dishonorable members of parliament and senators. Others smashed into the Senate chambers and took over as the people's representatives, so including one who acted as speaker. So this is what Gen Z were doing in parliament when they entered. The golden mace, a symbol of parliamentary authority, was carted away to set up a people's parliament in a liberated zone away from the discredited and dishonored National Assembly. He also says that, Mthethwa also says that the sound and fury of the youth was widespread across cities and towns in Kenya. The youthful protesters had dubbed it as 7 days of rage beginning 21st to the 27th of June. The 25th of June was the climax of the rage and referred to as Super Tuesday. That's the day I showed you in the first clip that saw the storming of Parliament. He also says, it has never happened this way in the history of resistance in Kenya, but more will happen in the future. So even if it has never happened this way before in the history of Parliament, certainly because of the coming together of certain factors that led to this discontent articulated in this manner, these protests emerged from a long history of protests, which for me, and as I argue, are targeting empire, targeting imperial remains and imperial invitations. So while marked by the dynamics particular to the moment, we said a youthful population, social media, there was lots of use of social media, a government that just coming to power. These June 25th actions and the actions in June were part of a long history of protests that targeted empire making, the endurance of empire making. And how was this articulated here? For example, for many young people, the IMF and World Bank were seen as reconstituted colonial actors. So whereas now land is not occupied, the way to oppress people was seen as through debt colonialism. So IMF and the World Bank were allowing, because they were seen as the principal actors behind this finance bill, they were seen as reconstituted colonial actors. But certainly many other people were protesting other things. Certainly the finance bill, but on the streets were also queer women, women who are also saying no to femicide because there's been a spike of femicide in the country, people who are there for Palestine, people who are there because they had been evicted. But all of these, in my understanding, are articulations or are targeting broadly this enduring or reinstantiation, as Stoller says, of empire. And you can see this perhaps most prominently when people name the actors that they see as colonial actors now, such as the IMF and World Bank. So we've looked at these protests that were the entry point into this discussion today, but how do we connect them, I think in my last 10 minutes, to these other protests before? We have these protests from 1990, which we call the Saba Day protests. Saba means 7. I don't know if it means 7 in Zulu also, I hope so. But Saba means 7. So it was 7th of July. So that was their name, but they were also there, they were there to fight for multipartism because in our post-independence period, we had the Kenyatta regime and the Moi regime who then put into law that we could not have more than one party. So whereas I think the ANC here, if I'm not reading the room wrong, has dominated because of a particular politics, but other parties have existed. At this point in time in Kenya's history, only one party was allowed. So that's the Kenya African National Union, which was KANU. And these protests in 1990 were part of an assemblage of reasons. Although the entry point was a demand for a multi-party system, it was also an assemblage of reasons that put people on the streets. Whether it is unemployment or other articulations of authoritarianism that put people on the streets. For me, even if and maybe I'm extrapolating too broadly, even if the target was multipartism, it also has bearing on imperial remains and imperial invitations because the sovereign or our president then was using an old constitution, in effect a colonial constitution because it was made in Britain, to implement or he changed it to implement this single party state. But our status quo or conditions were still emblematic or emerging from conditions that had not changed in the post-colonial period, our political economy of extraction that still endured, the class dynamics that still endured. So for me, this is still a target. Even these protests were targeting what I'm broadly calling imperial remains and imperial invitations. However, I think that perhaps the most emblematic and powerful example of this was the freedom struggles of throughout the Second World War, post-war period, but principally in our emergency period between 1952 and 1960, where the Kenya Land and Freedom Army took, I think people heard of the Mau Mau before, yeah? Or the Kenya Land and Freedom Army? Took to the forest, but also had urban military actions in cities to demand independence, to demand the return of land, and to fight for self-determination. So for me, while this is perhaps the most emblematic of a counter-empire actions, I think that continues and has bearing even in the present day actions. So the present day June 2024 actions. For me, because this is a collective struggle that, in the words of Cedric Robinson, allow for the co-production of a collective intelligence that informs struggle and that continues a Black radical tradition. So they are also, through accretion, allow for this collective intelligence that comes about through struggle that was present in the 50s, but even if brings together other factors or other conjunctural moments, is still targeting empire. And like I said, unfortunately, these moments encounter, part of the similarity, despite what they're targeting, is also the necropolitics that they encounter. So if we look at these pictures from a memorial ceremony that wanted to remember the Gen Z who were killed during the protests, we can see across all of these times, besides a similar target, they also encountered a similar necropolitical impetus. 67 young people were killed. Imagine, young people, most of whom under the age of 25, last year. The government responded with abductions as well, lots of denials, and this is documented, if you're interested, in a recent BBC documentary called Blood Parliament. But we can see that what is also similar, besides the endurance of remains, imperial remains and invitations, is this very sinister government action, these necropolitical conditions that respond to these bids for freedom, these bids for self-determination. So I will conclude, because I think I need to conclude, by coming back to my arguments, which I hope are clearer from this process. I've tried to show you how I arrived at this process and how my previous work informs how I'm thinking about enduring protests in Kenya. So my 4 arguments were: the protests of today are an accretion of past struggles, whether it's the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, whether it's the general strike of 1950, and they're informed by and reference struggles that are both past and present, and through this, a collective intelligence is born and shapes a practice that continues the Black radical tradition. Again, I said the target for me, broadly, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, is a continuous reinstantiation of empire. Whether it's not just empire that will take your land, the colonial period, it's also empire as instrumentalized through international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. So the broad target is empire, not just as an external force, but one that's reproduced through local conditions and local institutions. The third argument that I had is, unfortunately, across this time, besides the similar target, these insurgent actions encounter a very necropolitical force, but this dialectically shapes how people engage. For example, now, young people have withdrawn from the streets, but are trying to have other fields of action to respond to the government and to the authoritarianism that endures. But finally, there is hope. And through all of these tragic events, there are still some openings. I know I haven't talked about them so much now, but I think these are still unfolding from the June 2024 protests. But what we can say is that something has changed. And trying to also bring in Smriti's argument from yesterday, there's continual crisis, if that was what she was talking about, but there are these moments, these inflection moments that have revelatory power. And I think this June 2024 protest also had revelatory power that not only showed the real demands for young people, but also showed that the fight has really been the same along the years in our post-colonial moment. So these June 2024 protests had revelatory power, but we're still working what that means in all of our contradictory ways. And hopefully, this most recent iteration of protests, these insurgent democratic actions that reference the past and bring the past in the present, will keep allowing for a challenge to what we're calling, or what I was calling, imperial remains and invitations. And through this collective struggle, continue a black radical practice and knowledge production that will emerge insurgent once again. So I will stop now. I hope I spelled Siyabonga right. Yes? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Wangui. I thought that was great, especially as it not only traced the connections between everyday forms of politics and moments of large-scale protest,
Yeah.
but also because it pointed out to us how social formation states are defined by long trajectories of struggle. So, so on that note, I want to open it up to questions and comments from the audience. Our two discussants for today have also arrived. I'll introduce them a little later on. You're very welcome to join in the discussion if you want to. But yeah, the floor is yours, guys. Adam.
Yeah, so, you know, throughout this, I couldn't help but think, I think it's what most of us do if we're more familiar with our context than another, but kind of comparing this with the student protests that we had about a decade ago in South Africa, especially, you know, in 2015, it was, you know, a very hopeful moment and also obviously very youth-driven in South Africa, but cross-class and pluralistic and so on. So Fees Must Fall has since fizzled out, I think, in South Africa, due to many reasons, but one very stark feature there was co-optation of emergent leaders by the political party establishment, the African National Congress and stuff. So I just wonder if not a theoretical question or anything, but as an expert of Kenya, like, is there a similar pattern here where there's emerging youth leaders who are trying to be exploited by maybe opponents of Ruto, existing causes, so on? So yeah.
All right. Should we bunch a few together? Anyone else who wants to get in? Yes. Sam.
Thank you so much. That was really beautiful. I mean, every time Kenya comes up, I like, you can't help but think of the End SARS protest from Nigeria. So I don't know, like, I don't really have a particular question framed around the End SARS Nigeria and the finance bill in Kenya, but I don't know if you can maybe like draw parallels in between these, because these are both recent and they're both youth-led, and they had very different kind of like expressions, well, more similar, but in how they both end and how the society responds to these were interesting to kind of like observe from a distance. So I don't know if you could maybe draw parallels on that, and yeah.
Third one wants to get in there? Tatiana?
I was just wondering if, you know, looking into the history of protests in Kenya, if they were always so youth-led, and to what extent was the urban space as central as it was in this last protest? And I was also wondering, because I think the coloniality aspect of it is so evident. I was wondering also, to what extent do you look into the colonial theories around state formation? And yeah, it was very interesting to see the youth articulating like the IMF and World Bank as colonial actors, but also maybe the complicity of the state and the political elite with these colonial actors. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could comment on that as well.
Glad you handle those.
So in terms of cooptation, and I hope I'm not answering you in a long-winded way. And I also need to apologize to Gen Z, because you know Gen Z are my students, and I used to be like, I can't deal with this generation. They don't read. They come to class, everything is triggering them. I was really like against this generation, but so I need to publicly apologize to Gen Z and say thank you for shaming us and being on the streets. But at the same time, while I say that, I think this generation, as you saw in the BBC documentary, was saying we're leaderless, we don't have institutions, we can't be told anything. And I think in some ways that has led to a situation where the unity has fizzled out. But sometimes when struggles exist primarily online, then it masks the lack of like long-term genuine organization that is needed. So that's a big gap that people are seeing now, that there was not that organization to catch people after you could no longer be on the streets because the police would shoot you. What happens then? But tied to that, and actually trying to tie to, I guess, did I say, please tell me how I say it, Samelo, but also your presentation on Ethiopia. There were these very charismatic actors. I'm sure if you're watching the news then you'd see a guy with an afro, and you only used to go to the protests in a suit with a handkerchief. He used to be like, why would I get on the table with the negotiating table with the president when my peers are on the autopsy table? And everyone was so in awe of this guy. Young women were like, he smells so nice. But this person has now joined the government, which is a government premised on, right now, on like annihilation, annihilating people through taxes, through having police on the street. So there's been a lot of cooptation. But at the same time, a positive is that Kenyans have responded to that by more reflection and thinking, what can we do in the next round of this fire? Because the fire is coming. There's another fire. What can we do to organize ourselves so that we're not caught off guard? That if one charismatic leader goes, it doesn't diminish the message and that people were trying to put across when they were together on the streets, joyful, singing, playing football, wanting to occupy parliament. So there has been cooptation, but that has maybe discouraged some people. But I think there's now more reflection across all generations, not just young people, about what we do to institute change, not change that just sees one person move to a party, but how do we even question these formations of the party? What do we need to challenge the system besides like individual people? But I think part of the problem is that we're all invested because of, I would say, neoliberalism, although that's an amorphous term. We're all invested in this individuated cult personality of a leader. We always need that person. But that we all need to save each other and not be invested in this hero, this individuated form where we congregate all our desires. So that's something we also need to think about. In terms of the end SARS, I think Kenyan young people were inspired by many movements. They're also inspired by Bangladeshi students who took over the president's house. So there was a cross-fertilization of ideas and inspirations, whether it's SARS, whether it's Fees Must Fall, whether it's Bangladeshi students and people were really happy to draw on all of these fountains of inspiration across. But for sure, NSARS had the entry point to end this state force that was necropolitical also, this police force, because it's called the SARS, it's like the State Action Response or something that was really, from my understanding, an extra legal police force that was enacting lots of extrajudicial killings. So while SARS were the entry point, young people got to the streets and congregated because of a diversity of reasons. And that's the same for young people here. You know, the entry point may have been the finance bill, but there's long durée reasons to be on the street as well. And I think we can see that in Nigeria, we can see that with Fees Must Fall, we can see that with Bangladeshi students. So there was across the online platform, even if I'm a dinosaur and don't know how to use it, but X allows for people to learn from each other without the limits of, although there's, as you were saying, digital inequality, but it allows people to learn from each other in ways that they would not otherwise would have, and in real time. Yeah, and so young people were borrowing from each other and inspired by each other. Someone asked me, are all the protests youth-led? Was that you, Tiziana? In some ways, yes, but you know what, you can't, I think we were also in the case of Shaheen Bagh. We can't say that this moment was isolated from other moments. And that's why I like to think about how Cedric Robinson thinks about how the Black radical tradition emerges from a consistent struggle that enables a collective intelligence that you take forward, because we all learn from each other. And so while they may have been youth-led, they reference other times. You know, they reference the Saba Saba protests. They reference even more local neighborhood. I think Anjali was asking someone yesterday about what about these protests, Mriti? What about these protests that you can't see? So even these young people were building on protests from their neighborhoods, but it was because of, I think, the medium of channeling information. It was predominantly youth-led, but it also borrowed from past events. And ultimately, youth can't do this by themselves. Even the people who appeared to be supported as future presidents in a subsequent iteration that appear to have the most youth support are old. So you need well, I'm also old, but they're older than me. You need intergenerational collaboration and yeah. But the protests, we can't just look at the people on the streets. I think also our guest was saying this yesterday. There were medics who said, we are going to have medical camps, free medical camps for people who are suffering from tear gas or if they're shot. There were also mosques that were giving people water. So outside of the streets, there was this whole infrastructure that may not have been young, but that was integral to these protests as well. And in terms of the colonial theories, I need to say, I personally am very cautious of using the colonial, even if I'm always like, everything is colonial, because in my experience, I think we still need to understand the deep roots of colonialism, but also because I feel like decolonial has been taken up in university channels in ways that is instrumentalized for people's careers rather than embodied reflection. So for me, I feel like if we understand decolonial approaches, and not to say we shouldn't think about them, because we need to think about them, but we need to understand that it's always going to be a crossroads. You're always going to be at the crossroads, and it may not look the same everywhere, and we may not have fully decolonial entities, but we can just agree that it's always going to be a crossroads. So, and it's a collective participation. So I really don't know if I've answered your question, but one thing I can say is that young people were saying we are anti-colonial. This government, someone had a sign saying, Ruto, who's our president, who I won't say what I actually wanted to call him because there's a camera, but Ruto, someone had a sign saying Ruto is the village elder of the IMF. So basically he's the, and the village elder is always the, what can I say a village elder is? Village elder is always like the sellout, right? Well, not always. So he's like this, our sellout to the IMF. And so it's interesting that that person showed how Ruto was inextricably linked to these colonial institutions, and how this embodied response against him was also a response to those institutions that are seen as instantiating coloniality. I really don't know if I've answered your question. I think I've given you my own existential crises rather than answer your question. Anyway.
All right, let's do another round. Dua, and then here, and what's your third one? Yeah, awesome. Okay.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful a lot, and there's a lot of synergies between the Penning case and the Tunisian case. I want to go back to what you mentioned about the lack of a long organizational vision.
I am curious because you mentioned this is a moment of withdrawal, or rather an authoritarian or repression-induced withdrawal. I'm wondering that in these moments of withdrawal, what kind of archiving work, memory keeping that is happening or not by these groups? How is the memory of the protests being kept alive in concrete ways that might be helpful for future mobilizations?
I'm Tana. I am not an academic. I work with activists and community education programs. But I don't know really like it.
And I was thinking about both those questions because it's so relevant. My parents were very involved in the struggle against, anti-apartheid struggle, in the 70s and the 80s. But they, I suppose you're at UCT, so you'll know Neville Alexander. They were in that group. And so when I do work with young people now in townships, there isn't that memory of those things, right? The things that were done then, but also the ideas. And so I'm very interested in, where did these young people get the knowledge of those things, and what is the best way in order to teach those things to a different generation? Because I feel like our generation who's kind of in between those two, like the liberation movement and then currently what's happening now, have such a responsibility to transpose those ideas, because it isn't just about the tactics. I think that there's a lot of talk about the tactics and what needs to be done, but the intellectual memory, if you like, needs to be carried through somehow, and it needs to be done through sort of long haul political education. I'm always interested in hearing people's ideas as to how that could happen, the best way that could happen.
Thanks so much, Wangui. This is such a beautiful, rich presentation. I'm just wondering if you could speak to a little of some of the contradictions that you might see between the protesters, right? Because I'm sometimes a bit wary of the romanticism that comes with protests, right? And especially young people. Some of those contradictions. And I'm also wondering, what was the relation of these protests to the sort of more traditional protests that might have happened along sort of economic lines in Kenya? And I'm thinking specifically like trade unions maybe, or left sectors who might have taken up like anti-austerity protests. So what was the relations or dynamics there maybe?
One thing I'm very grateful for is that, for example, if the spark was the anti-finance bill, was the finance bill, young people took to TikTok to shorten a 200-page document into, say, 2 minutes of what it was saying and how it would impact people's lives in different languages. So there are various forms of political education, not just in terms of, so certainly about the finance bill, but in terms of, I think young people have other imaginaries that my generation don't have, because we still have fear via osmosis of the authoritarian or this sovereign that will always be out to kill us. So whereas my generation, millennials, are you with me? Are there other millennials here? Maybe they may, we may have, at least in the Kenyan case, a memory of a dictatorship. And so our actions are shaped by that, but we are also, I think, probably the last generation who can hang on to this fake ideal of a meritocracy, that you leave school and you get a job. This generation don't have that. It's what someone says is a great con. It's just a con. Your school is not going to be good because the government is not giving enough money. You'll go to university, it's triple the fees for less, and you'll come out, 1 million graduates of you every year, and you don't have a job. So I think because of this, I can still maybe hold on to the great con that things are meritocracy, and if I do well, it'll happen, notwithstanding my own middle class privilege. But this generation have other imaginaries because it's just not possible. And so they look for who can I learn from? They also have access to information about other struggles. They can also, I think, have less, they're not interested also in a respectability politics. So for some reason, I'm not sure of the young people you're talking about, I feel like the generation below me are interested in searching for other imaginaries, histories that we are not taught in school, and educating each other, maybe not in a weekly cell session of political education, but sending each other information, trying to think of mutual aid ways to support each other during COVID, and just have other imaginaries. But it's also necessitated by the conditions in which they find themselves. Certainly they have access to the internet, but also their material conditions. Young people are basically a class. They're a class because our underclass, because they're not going to get jobs. They still need to live with their parents. They can't afford houses. So the material conditions necessitate this search. But I also think they also are more interested in searching for other imaginaries. But there's political education going on in Twitter. There's different formations, and people assembling through various campaigns, whether it's feminists, whether it's queer rights, whether it's environmental campaigns, whether it's, just coming together to support each other in different ways, partially necessitated by material conditions. But there's political education happening in different ways. Not just like how I used to, you meet every Saturday to read this or a book club, but in different ways, I think, that are particular to their generation. There was a question about memory work. I think this ties on to the memory work. Some of them, post this protest, some of the most beautiful things I've seen are people renaming streets with the names of people who are killed by the police. So even if the city council will come in a big truck and knock it down, the pictures of that still remain in people's hearts. So instead of calling this road Kimari Street, we'll call it Rex Masai. And Rex Masai was the first young person shot on June 25th. There's that kind of memory work. There's lots of, writings about what happened then. There's lots of videos. In fact, the BBC took some of those videos and made a documentary called Blood Parliament. There's lots of documenting of people's lives. Who were they before they were shot on the streets, and what were they aspiring for? And I think the access to technology allows for memorialization in a less normative way. So people can do whatever they need to do to memorialize these young people. And also through humor. Part of the way of memorializing is then reimagining the government in a different way. So sometimes instead of calling our president Ruto, young people just start calling him Must Go, because he needs to go. So there's Must Go. There are all of these memes about him and his government. So this is also a way, while it's memorializing the blood of young people, it's also a symbol for us to remember the forces behind that. So you're not just remembering Rex Masai, but you're remembering the government that deemed him disposable so that it could govern in an authoritarian way. So there's different ways of memorializing. And in turn, I had wanted to say this earlier, for young people in the neighborhood where I worked in Madare, for me as a middle-class person, before I got to Madare, I wasn't thinking, this is still a colonial fight. But the way young people would, some young people would reference the government would be in a term that signifies colonial collaborators. So they'd say, these people are Ngati. And Ngati were the people who the colonial government used to put a sack on, so you can't see them. I think you call it, in Kenya we call it gunia, but it's like a sackcloth. And they would come and point out who's Mau Mau. So young people, younger than me, but everyone's younger than me these days, but younger than me would be like, that's Ngati. And this is a vernacular of the 40s and 50s and 60s that's endured, which then really emphasized for me that people still feel that the struggles of the past are in the present. So that's also a way of memorializing, still referencing this government as a Ngati government. And one thing I wanted to say, I think this is, Pasan, your question was about contradictions, right? What's very interesting is that there was no, and Kenya is full of NGOs. I don't know if South Africa is full of NGOs. And NGOs have many contradictions. But none of these protests were funded or called by NGOs, which was really important. People took, my sister works in a bank, was there, you know? People of all walks of life took themselves there. But I think some of the contradictions that remain is because there was no organization to this. But it's also hard to organize 1 million people on the streets into a collective formation. I think some of the work to respond to the present has fallen on NGOs because they have money, they have internet, they have rooms, they have spaces. So that's a contradiction. Trade unions in Kenya are really, to be honest, non-existent. We had a really powerful trade union history that allowed for the general strike of 1950, partially led by a really powerful Sikh Kenyan called Makan Singh. And Makan Singh is thought of as kind of the one of the main progenitors of trade union movement in Kenya. So it was really powerful. In 1950, that paralyzed everything. And it's important to say that in that period, also Senegalese and Ivory Coast railway workers were striking. From the 1945 to the early 50s, there were so many strikes across Africa. And while the entry point was labor, it was also the colonial condition. In Senegal, they paralyzed the railway system for 6 months. And just like the Nairobi General Strike, there was paralysis in the colonial city. But since then, unfortunately, unions have been weakened and are just appendages of the state. I can tell you, I think we talked about this in less polite terms, but ultimately, they're appendages of the state and they're not there for the worker. The living wage is not implemented. If you're an appendage of the state, and the Kenyan state has historically been in love with capitalism, we're also imperial lackeys in that we are happy to occupy Haiti or Somalia. If you're an appendage of the state, then you're not pro-worker, and so people are not organized around labor, unfortunately. I think those are contradictions I can think about.
Right, another round of questions. Rungesa?
So people in the region, particularly in East Africa, we always look at Kenyan politics with very concern. It is very dynamic politics, and it becomes, most of the time, the youth consider the Kenyans as a model, actually. But something that always I was wondering is that in many regards, Kenya is better than most of its neighboring states. If we take Ethiopia, if you take Uganda, numerical statistics talk very differently, actually. Material condition, in terms of political situation, human rights condition. But while we don't have activities and such like very vigilant use in other neighboring countries we have in Kenya. So probably that may not be also exclusively for you, even we can discuss on it, what factors lead to people to protest, to come to the streets. Is it really the objective reality, or it's something culturally or something that we can relate to political culture in Kenya that makes them to actively respond to some new changes than other neighboring states or in the region? Thank you.
Okay, all right, Joe.
Hi everyone, my name's Joel. My colleague Sapiwe and I took the train up from Johannesburg, where we work at WITS, and I'm not entirely sure how to frame this question, because it's not actually a question I believe in, but I guess I want to play a bit of a devil's advocate around this emphasis you have on continuity. And I want to make the kind of countervailing kind of argument, even if I don't necessarily believe it. Because it strikes me that your analysis is very much the past is in the present, and there's never really a past. And there's remains, debris, accretion, sedimentation, afterlives, all of those kind of cluster of ideas around this idea of institutional and political sedimentation. And I guess my question then becomes, can anything be new? and if, on what basis can we actually see and diagnose and describe and respond to things that are genuinely distinct and different to what came previously? Because Nairobi, as you know, it's a colonial city, but it's also a city that's grown massively. It used to be small and now it's huge. It's urban, it's very different in its landscape configuration than it used to be under colonial rule. So I'm just kind of wondering that the people protesting in the streets think they're doing something new. And there's an analysis that says that one of the things arising out of this protest is a move away from sedimented ethnicities where people are trying to understand themselves as being more than Kikuyu or Luo or Kalenjin and so on. And consequently, being young, they overstate the rupture because we all know there's going to be a snapback. But in your analysis, it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of space or emphasis on things being radically different and distinct from where they were before. They get pulled back into this narrative where the past is always not only present, but prominent to the point of being the primary determinant of all outcomes. So methodologically, how do we know when something's new? Can something be new?
Yes, I'll also hold Spirit Dube, also politics, vets. So I have two questions. One is just a clarification question. So I understand remains and durability of empire, but I don't see invitations, or I don't get what invitations means in this context, because that's a positive ascription in the context of negative talk. So I would just like some clarity on that. But I think my second question kind of hinges or builds on what Joel is saying, but is a little bit more drawing on the theory that you're using. So if we think of Achille Mbembe's notion of commandment and the ways in which that's about how power, constructs the reality that it describes, and you can see that what you describe is exactly that, right? The police are used by the government in order to say that we have a problem, right? So the question then becomes, where the politics of hope then coming from, right? That's the basic question.
I hope I'm not so long-winded. My mother's very long-winded, and I feel like I'm taking that up. But I want to answer your question kind of in a roundabout way. So, has anyone heard of youth bulge theory? Where because of coincidence of low maternal child death rates, but still high fertility, then this is usually ascribed to brown and black countries, but then there arises a huge demographic of young people. So a situation where in Kenya, in the Middle East, in I think South Africa also, there's what they call a youth bulge, which is such an unflattering term, which I don't think Americans are ever called a youth bulge. Canadians are never called a youth bulge. But why I'm bringing this in, and it's a roundabout response to you, is because it's often used to, even the African Development Bank says, we need to make sure this big demographic of young people is a dividend, a demographic dividend, and not a time bomb. Literally, that's what the World Bank says, African Development Bank says. I'm sure it's the same in other places, maybe even Sri Lanka, where there's this a big demographic of youth. And why I'm thinking about that, I guess, is because that's often used to say, we told you, you have all these kids and now they're running amok on the streets and burning your parliament. But there are other factors, I think, that prompt Kenyans to perhaps protest more than their neighbors. I think there's the still lived recognition of the Mau Mau freedom fighters, which maybe are as iconic for us as, say, Che Guevara is in Cuba. You still remember the Mau Mau, whereas your parents don't remember the Mau Mau because the Mau Mau was banned as a political entity until 2002. Can you imagine? 2002, which is 40 years after independence, freedom fighters are banned. So there's still living memory of that. Sometimes I wonder also what else is there, because, for example, Kenyans were on the street, whereas in Uganda, Museveni said, no protest, you can march in a stadium. Go and enact your political rights in an enclosed space. Rwanda, we know what the situation is in Rwanda, you can't protest. And so I would like to think about that a bit more without ascribing exceptionalism to Kenyans, because I also think Kenyans also think like South Africans are exceptional. So I don't want us to perpetuate this exceptionality. But I would say why I brought up the youth bulge is to kind of just put that in the air while we think about that. But also I think there's this living history of protests that's partially informed by the still presence of Mau Mau people and Mau Mau iconicity. But it's very, this is tangential, but for people who work on online spaces, there's a group called Kenyans on Twitter who are seen as like, Kenyans love X. They're seen as the most like, they just need one thing, and there's this hive of Kenyans responding to it. So Kenyans are also very active online. I would say, if I may, but not to perpetuate our exceptionalism, is I think there's also an education system that maybe most people, I think our literacy rate, if you're going to partake in these spheres, is higher than many other countries in the region. So perhaps that can also play into that. Joel, I like your question. I think maybe if I can make a clarification, what I was saying is not that the protest articulations are all the same, but rather that broadly, the target is the same. So, for example, from Mau Mau to young people, they're responding, and not to be like a dogmatic Marxist or but it's not all structured. I'm not here to say like, this is deterministic forever and we can never move out of class or race. Or, I think I'm more in the vein of Stuart Hall, where I see this contingency. But not to say that these articulations, I'm saying these articulations are new, they're unparalleled, and they also emerge from a conjunction of factors. But I do actually think that it's the afterlives of colonialism that young people are targeting, even if their actions are completely different from how I protested in 2007. It's completely different. So not to say that there's never anything new. It's completely new. One people on the streets in Kenya, that is completely unforeseen. That it was also cross-class wow, middle class people are pretty useless everywhere, but they were on the streets then. They're pretty useless. I don't know about South Africa, but they're on the streets then. My sister works in a bank, was on the streets. Religious leaders on the streets. South Asian descendants in Kenya are on the streets. So this is, we can never, I don't want to capture it all in a blank slate, but I do think what they're responding to is the longue durée of really like empire in its articulation in Kenya. Sifiwe, I think, did I say Sifiwe? You were asking me about what I mean by invitations. So this is a way of also saying, sure, there's a long durée of imperial remains, durabilities, afterlife, sure. But this then, what it does is that it removes the agency of African states, like actually tied to Alf's question, who are super happy to be complicit in this reproduction. So how I was thinking about this, for example, because most of my work is on urban issues. Kenya will say, or the African Development Bank will say, we are going to perpetuate this model of development or model of capitalism, even without the UK help. We're going to build these super highways that are not benefiting everyone and not responding to material conditions. But we are agents in this because we want to perpetuate an Africa Rising narrative. And it's our invitation to whoever to build this railway, whether it's China, whether it's Turkey, whether it's someone. But this for me is an imperial invitation, but it's tied to a reinstantiation of colonialism, although outside of north-south configurations and more south-south configurations. So it's an invitation. You're like, we're new. We're saying we've ruptured imperialism, but this is our own. What we're going to do is we're going to reproduce it in our own way through other invitations. I hope.
Make it empire.
Yeah, we're happy to occupy Haiti, but because Kenya is in Haiti, this is not imperialism. Of course, it's imperialism, you know. But we have received that invitation and have given that invitation. So it's just grounding these forms of empire making without always blaming UK but recognizing our own state complicity in these reproductions of empire. Yeah, and in terms of hope, did someone ask me about hope? Yeah, ask me about hope. I do think there's hope, even if did you see that video of young people on the streets? They have hope. That is hope. They never met each other until that day. But they're dancing and they all have in that moment, there is an opening that is signaled in that moment. And I think we must hold on to it, even if things seem so dire. They're definitely an opening. Even if I think I waver in my optimism, we can't ignore that really something took 1 million people on the streets, and it can happen again, and it will happen again. And so I think that's why it's important to hold on to it, even if we see like authoritarianism in overdrive right now. There's so many. Ruto is banning everything. It's like no more protests. Of course, Kenyans don't listen, but you're only listening because of the necropolitical encounter you're going to have. But if there was no military shoring up this illegitimate regime, people would be on the streets. But there are openings, and I think there is hope, and yeah, there's hope.
Thanks, Wangui. That
Thank
was great.
you.
All right.
Thank you.